Have you ever stood at the edge of an impossible promise? A moment where the gap between what's spoken and what's possible feels too vast to bridge. Meet Abraham, a man whose legacy hinges on the divine vow he could never fulfill on his own. Barren, aged, flawed, yet chosen. His story isn't just ancient history, it's a mirror held up to our deepest questions about faith, control, and what it truly means to trust. What happens when the God of the universe asks you to surrender the very thing that he promised? How do you reconcile a miracle with a knife in your hand? And why does true maturity look less like gaining control and more like becoming childlike? In this journey through the life of Abraham, we'll unravel the tension between human desperation and divine promise. We'll confront the shocking test of a father and his son, and dissect the cost of clinging to our own solutions, and discover why God's greatest blessings often demand our greatest surrender. This isn't just a story about ancient rituals, it's about the heart of faith itself. It asks the question, what are you holding on to? And what might happen if you let go? So let's pull on this thread together and uncover how the unthinkable becomes the undeniable, where surrender births legacy and the knife in our hand reveals the God who holds eternity. One of the biggest issues that we saw last week with the story of Abram was that he had this grand promise. God was going to multiply him. He was going to bless him, make his name great. But Abram and his wife, Sarai, were incapable of conceiving. So you ask, how could Abram, and I'm sure Abram thought this as well, how could Abram be remembered? How would his name be made great? How could his name be carried on if he had no lineage? We have to see this as the fulcrum that balances God's promise. With no son, there's no way that the promise can be fulfilled. But also, Abram and Sarai, they aren't the epitome of youth and fertility at this point either. So realistically, not only have they been unable to conceive during the whole of their childbearing years, but now they seem to be physiologically and biologically incapable of reproducing because of their age. And this seeming impasse is where we find ourselves in Genesis chapter 17. And I'm going to jump over we're going to jump through this chapter. We're not going to read the whole chapter. So feel free. We're going to jump through the book of Genesis as well. Feel free to listen along, but certainly, or you can read along on the screen as well, and that's fine. And we're going to read just verses 1 through 8, and I'll probably stop somewhere in the middle there. So it says in Genesis chapter 17, starting in verse 1, when Abram was 99 years old, that's pretty old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am the sovereign God. Walk before me and be blameless. Then I will confirm my covenant between me and you, and I will give you a multitude of descendants. Okay, pause there. Notice this is intending to be the confirmation of a covenant that was already established. God is telling him, okay, if you would like me to confirm my covenant with you, then you must walk blamelessly. So the covenant hasn't been confirmed, and the covenant isn't even being confirmed now. We'll read later that the covenant is going to be confirmed with a test that happens in Genesis chapter 22. And this is a conditional covenant, right? What's the condition? If Abram will continue to walk before God and be blameless, then God will give him a multitude of descendants. And we've got to ask, I thought this covenant was already established. What's going on? Why is this being reiterated again? And we have to remember, this is right after Abram messed up. That's a light way of putting it. But remember, we talked about it last week. He had a lapse in faith. He tried fulfilling God's promise via Hagar and Ishmael. And we'll talk about later in Galatians what these two children, Ishmael and Isaac, represent. But in essence, he tried to fulfill God's promise through his own hand, through his own merit, by his own will. And this follows in the pattern of what we've seen in Genesis so far, of ignoring God and taking things into our own hand. So what does God do? He doesn't burn down Abram's camp. He doesn't banish him. He doesn't curse him. He doesn't send a flood. He doesn't disperse him. That's kind of all the things that God was doing with people prior to Abraham, generally with large groups of people as a whole, but God's dealing with Abram on an individual level right now. What does he do? He reaffirms the covenant. It says, as the chapter continues, it says, Abram bowed with his face to the ground, and God said to him, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer will your name be Abram. Instead, your name will be Abraham, because I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you extremely fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will descend from you. I will confirm my covenant as a perpetual covenant between me and you. It will extend to your descendants after you throughout their generations. I will be your God and the God of your descendants after you. I will give the whole land of Canaan, the land where you are now residing, to you and your descendants after you, as a permanent possession. I will be their God." That's beautiful, right? God is still upholding his end of the bargain. But something has changed for Abram, right? His name is now Abraham. He goes from exalted father, which is that, to father of a multitude. Now, what's interesting here is that this is not a new covenant on God's end, at least. God's promises to Abraham now are still the same as when he was called Abram. And you can literally read in Genesis 15, God's not making new promises. So we have to ask ourselves, what's the significance? What's the significance with what's going on right now? Well, we already mentioned this, but this takes place after he faltered, right? After God establishes a covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15. There's slain animals. He passes through those things. It's a whole thing. And then right after that, Abram at this point, goes out in Genesis 16, like the next chapter, and he does what he does with Hagar. And this is an indication that Abram doubts God's promise. He falters. So the new thing that is happening here in Genesis 17 is that Abraham is now going to be held accountable. He's asked to be blameless. Expectations are set. His name is changed to Abraham, or the father of a multitude. And later in the chapter, God establishes circumcision as the sign or the seal of the covenant for generations to come. But everything that changed was around Abraham, not God. And this story really looks at how our relationship with God matures as people who follow him. As people who strive to walk before him and be blameless. There is a time when we have to take accountability for our faith, or our lack of it. Sometimes the solution to spiritual floundering is to take on responsibility, and the responsibility that comes from the pressure of God's promise to us. But the pressure that God is putting on Abraham, and the pressure that is put on us when we enter into covenant relationship with God, is not the pressure that you would say comes from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? We're not responsible for knowing how things are going to work out. We're not responsible for fulfilling the promise. That was a mistake that Abraham made. He did it through his own knowledge, through his own presuppositions about how the promise was going to be fulfilled. But you're not responsible for the promise. You're not responsible for memorizing every verse in the Bible or being able to perfectly articulate your theological positions with this extreme logical precision. What's the pressure that God puts on us? Because it's not that. What's the pressure that God is putting on Abraham here? What does God require? All he requires is this: walk before him and be blameless. That's what God asks of Abraham, and that's what he asks of us. And that's really all God has ever required of anyone. You can freely eat from any tree in the garden, but just know that as soon as you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will no longer be blameless. You will no longer be innocent. What does Jesus say, right? Ironically, the path to Christ-like maturity is the path to becoming like a child. And remember, Abraham, he's not spiraling downward like all of Genesis before him, right? They were moving from the innocence of the garden to total corruption and deception in Babel. And if we're not careful, we can be deceived into thinking that maturity is just like that. You know, how many people think that growing up is a similar trajectory? You know, we become more self-conscious, more independent, more anxious, more skeptical of the world around us. You know, we accumulate more knowledge. There's less wonder. There's less awe in life. And there's this idea that the marker of maturity is when that little bubble pops. You know, you sober up and you realize life isn't all that you'd conceptualized it to be in your childlike fervor. Maturity, for most people, is just a loss of innocence. That's how they would define it. And it's so normalized that it just seems right. You know, it seems like it's what we should do. You know, we mature and we become independent. We take life into our own hands. And there's some crucial principles to that, right? But the crucial principle that lies at the center of the Abraham story is meant to ask readers a question. What are we supposed to be holding on to? What does maturity actually look like? What's my role in all of this? If I can really have a relationship with God, the divine creator of the cosmos, what does that even look like on a personal level? What am I supposed to do? And this is largely the question, what am I in control of? What am I responsible for? And there's one story in the life of Abraham that brings this to a forefront like no other. If we fast forward to Genesis chapter 22, Isaac, he's been born to Abraham and Sarah, which is considered to be a miracle because they're well into their 90s, if not likely past 100. Hagar and Ishmael, they've been kicked out of the camp into the desert, and that's a whole other story. But Isaac, he's growing up. Everything looks great. You know, God has shown Abraham that he's following through on his promises, but all of a sudden there's a wrench that's thrown into all of this. And we'll just read it. I'm gonna try to read through the whole chapter without pausing, if I can do that, if that's possible. I'm gonna try to read through it all, so just bear with me. But I want you to listen to the story, and I want you to heed the invitation to be immersed in it as we read it. Genesis 22, starting in verse 1. Sometime after these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," Abraham replied. God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah," or Moriah. "Offer him up there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will indicate to you." Early in the morning, Abraham got up, saddled his donkey. He took 2 of his young servants with him, along with his son Isaac. When he had cut the wood for the burnt offering, he started out for the place God had spoken to him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham caught sight of the place in the distance. So he said to his servants, "You two stay here with the donkey while the boy and I go up there. We will worship and then return to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son Isaac. Then he took the fire and the knife. And I'm going to pause here because there's really beautiful imagery of the son carrying the wood up the mountain for the burnt offering. There's interesting parallels to Christ, who is the Son, taking the very object which he will be sacrificed up the hill of Golgotha. But we're not going to talk about that today. But if you want to know more about that, you can certainly leave a comment and we can talk about that. But there's some really interesting Christological parallels here. Anyway. Then he took the fire and the knife in his hand, and the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father, Abraham, "My father." "What is it, my son?" he replied. "Here's the fire and the wood," Isaac said. "But where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" "God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Abraham replied. The two of them continued on together. When they came to the place God had told them about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. Next, he tied up his son Isaac, placed him on the altar on top of the wood. And then Abraham reached out his hand, took the knife, and prepared to slaughter his son. But the Lord's angel called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he answered. "Do not harm the boy," the angel said. do not do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, because you did not withhold your son, your only son, from me." This is the moment when the covenant is confirmed, right? I said it was going to be confirmed in Genesis chapter 22. This is the test. It continues on in chapter 13. Abraham looked up and saw behind him a ram caught in the bushes by its horns. So he went over, got the ram, and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, "The Lord Provides." It is said to this day, "In the mountain of the Lord provision will be made." The Lord's angel called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "I solemnly swear by my own name, decrees the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you, and I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be as countless as the stars in the sky or the grains of sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the strongholds of their enemies because you have obeyed me. All the nations of the earth will pronounce blessing on one another using the name of your descendants." Okay, this is a really interesting story. It's a really beautiful story. A lot of people have a problem with this story because it doesn't necessarily fit our modern idea of how we think a father-son relationship should go. And literarily, this story it's a direct contrast to when Abram conceived with Hagar to create Ishmael, right? In that story, Abram takes it upon himself to fulfill God's promise. In this story, however, Abraham lets go of control, even though the promise is already established. Even though it means that the promise would go unfulfilled. So that it's an opposite reciprocal of what's happening with Ishmael. And here's the problem with reading these stories with a reductionist lens, or with like this modern/postmodern framework, right? You read this story totally flabbergasted that God would test somebody in this way. You think that it's morally sadistic or emotionally traumatizing that this all-loving God would put both a father and a son in a life-threatening and compromising situation. And for what? So that the all-knowing, omniscient God could learn whether or not Abraham was faithful, as if God didn't know what was in Abraham's heart, like he does with the heart of every other man. But you have to sit back and say, I don't think that that's what this story is trying to convey. I don't think that that's supposed to be the central focus of what's going on here. The testing of Abraham is the moment where God seals his covenant with Abraham forever. Promises were made, yes, but remember the condition. Abraham must walk blamelessly before God. And this challenges us to think about what it means to walk blamelessly, or what it means to walk in innocence. Abraham just strapped his son to a pile of wood. He's got the knife lifted into the air to kill him, fully intending to slaughter his son and ignite the body, watch it burn. And to the modern reader, that doesn't feel, sound, or look like someone who's the paragon of spiritual integrity. And yet, it is this moment that stands out as the example of faith. And it has for thousands of years, for over thousands of years, thousands and thousands of years, and for billions of people. And why? It's because faith is not something that we get as much as it's something that we give up. To be faithful, to pursue God, to have a relationship with God is not something that's shiny and new and revolutionary. It's actually something that is very old. It's dimly lit within every single one of us, but it's been covered up by selfishness, greed, gluttony, sin, self-consciousness, whatever it is. This connection that we have with God is inherent in every child that you see, before they have matured. It's this innocence, this willingness to be dependent, to be weak, to believe. This is why all of these certain types of people will inherit the kingdom, right? They seem to be the weak, the poor. All of these types of people that Jesus describes will inherit the kingdom have these very childlike natures to them. It's not a conscious belief in God that children have. Their faith in God is unquestionably interwoven within their very essence, within the innermost part of their being, and the way that it manifests is not the way that we do as conscious beings with the confession of the tongue and good works and all that stuff. It manifests as innocence, as trust, as love. It manifests as a willingness to believe. But faith is lost as our self-consciousness accumulates knowledge about the world and about ourselves. It's like the story of Adam and Eve playing out in the lives of every child who grows into adulthood. But the story of Abraham is beautiful because it shows us that God is always willing to meet us where we're at. After we've fallen, after we've lost our innocence, after we have chosen the wrong path, God meets us in the gutter and presents us with a choice. He offers to restore that faith, that flame, that relationship with Him that lies dormant within us due to our self-consciousness and sin. He offers a promise to each and every single one of us. And it's not an exclusive promise to a select group of people. The promise is made to all, but there are few who will enter into covenant, right? Why? Because it means that you must leave everything else behind. And not a lot of people want to do that. To be a child again means that you forsake all the things that you have gained that make you an adult, the things that made you mature. Jesus calls His disciples to forsake all. Look at the rich young ruler, right? God requires that Abraham leaves his homeland and leaves his family, wandering out into the wilderness, totally dependent upon God. And unless Abraham fully comes under the dependence of God until he becomes like a child, he cannot be the father of a multitude. Why is that? It made me ask the question, how are good fathers made? Good fathers are made by good fathers. Before Father Abraham can have many sons, Abraham himself has to be a good son. And this is how the story of the binding of Isaac, the sacrificing of Isaac, begins to make sense for us. This is how our Christian life begins to make sense. Faith is about the restoration of a relationship between father and child. A child doesn't need to know how things are going to work out. He only needs to trust that his father has it under control. And this is more than just a test. This is a testament for all of us. Thousands upon thousands of years later, we get to see faith in action. And it's probably not what we thought it was. It is our call. It's our purpose to let go of our false idols of assurance, of man-made confidence, of pride, of self-reliance. And I'm afraid that Christianity has too many prideful fathers and not enough humble sons. I fear that people are deceived into thinking that God's arm can be twisted, that we actually have more control than what we do, than what we think. Because tell me, how did that work out for Abram? And Galatians 4 tells us that Abraham had two sons. One of them was by a slave woman, and the other one was by a free woman. But one, the son of the slave woman, was born by natural descent, while the other, the son of the free woman, Sarah, was born through the promise. Is it not true that God scatters and casts out anything born out of our own anxious and self-centered workings? God will not share His throne with us. You cannot work your way into the promise of salvation. You can't logically deduce or scripturally interpret yourself into right standing with God. It just doesn't work. All that you can do, the power, the thing that we can do, because we can do something, all that we can do is give up. Not just the things that seem wrong or harmful either. Yes, give those up. But did not God even ask for what was good and right and healthy? He asked for the very promise that He gave to Abraham. It's not just good enough to give up one half of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's not just good enough to give up the evil on the tree. God wants the entirety of the good and the bad. He wanted Abraham to let go of Ishmael and Isaac. And it was at this moment on Mount Moriah that Abraham became a son of God. Everything was given up. That's what God requires. That's what faith is about. We know sin is wrong and we know that our doctrines are right. Yeah, absolutely. But guess what? The folks across the street, down the road, in other churches, other religions, they believe in their own things just as much, if not more, than you do. And you know what? There are some that are more zealous, more well-spoken, more successful, more intelligent than we are, than you are. But this mentality to double down, to treat it like us four and no more, it's nothing but slavery. And how do I know this, right? I would be sitting in my prior tradition right now, jumping up and down, hooping and hollering in a full three-piece suit, if I had had a moment where I gave up everything. I gave up Ishmael and Isaac. I gave up the good and the bad. I gave up my successes and my failures. I gave up doctrine and dogma, deeply rooted friendships, my community, my feeling of assurance, my career prospects, everything in the world that I held close. Why did I give that up? Because I realized that the only identity that mattered was being a son. Whether things were good or bad, healthy or unhealthy, if I wanted to fit through that narrow gate and walk along the narrow way, I couldn't be holding on to anything. And this is a hard teaching. It asks us to lay down our doctrines and traditions, our assurance, our confidence, our years of knowledge and experience. But we have to trust that God will give us back whatever we need. Sometimes, like with the case of Abraham, sacrifice is not the end. It's just a way that we indicate our priorities. Isaac was not lost. The promise was not unfulfilled. Abraham only showed us that the promise should never come before the promise giver. When we place our beliefs about God before God himself, are we not doing exactly what the Pharisees did? What Abram did when Ishmael was conceived? That's not faith. That's slavery. And the only way to be set free is to die. But it's funny, we love our chains. And we love them because slavery offers predictability and stability. But the call of God is to break free, to leave it all, to go forth, to make disciples, to be fruitful, to multiply. This is the call of the gospel. To forsake all, to become like a child again, to have a restored relationship with God. But that's not something that we gain. It's something that is restored through what we lose, through our sacrifices. So I ask you, what things have you clung on to? Especially those things that feel justifiable. Because whatever it is, God is calling you to let go.